Hi, this is Doc Ina, and welcome to my lecture on plotting and interpreting dystocia curves. To download my lecture deck, please go to my WordPress site, Doc Ina Obigaile. So basically, we have three types of abnormal labor patterns: the prolongation disorder, protraction disorder, and the arrest disorder. So among these three, the easiest to rule in or rule out would be prolongation disorder, because it's the only abnormal labor pattern that is seen during the latent phase. What does that mean? It means that if you have a patient who you notice is having abnormally prolonged labor and an internal examination at the time of presentation, her cervix is just 4 centimeters dilated or less than 4 centimeters, then the abnormal labor pattern for this patient is automatically prolongation disorder. Now, for the active phase, which means that the cervical dilatation is beyond 4 centimeters, we have two abnormal labor patterns. That's the protraction disorder and arrest disorder. Now, we are very fortunate that we have this table that is provided by Williams Obstetrics to help us or guide us in correctly diagnosing the abnormal labor pattern that's involved. So if you can see here, we have diagnostic criteria for the nulliparous and for the multiparous, and of course, the preferred treatment for each abnormal labor pattern involved. Let's practice. Okay, so we have a case here, a patient who came in at the 7th hour of labor with cervical dilatation of 6 centimeters and station -3. So let's plot that. 2 hours later, the cervix dilated to 8 centimeters and the fetal head descended to station -2. At the 11th hour of labor, the cervix dilated to 9 centimeters, still at station -2. At the 13th hour of labor, the cervix is fully dilated, with fetal head still at station -2. And in 1 hour after, the fetal station was still at station -2. Okay, so notice that after plotting the internal examination findings, we have this type of labor curve. Obviously, this is not a normal labor curve because the descent curve did not even reach the x-axis. Ideally, if this is a normal labor curve, or if the patient is able to successfully deliver vaginally, the labor curve should ideally look like this. Right. However, our labor curve looks like this. Okay, so automatically, you will suspect that indeed there is some form of abnormal labor pattern. Now, the question is, which abnormal labor pattern is involved? Okay, the first question to ask yourself is the patient at the time of examination in the latent phase or the active phase? Well, obviously, this cervical dilatation reached 10 centimeters. And therefore, automatically, the patient is in the active phase at the time of presentation. All right. So, again, we will guide ourselves using this table. So, as I've said, we have already ruled out prolongation disorder because this patient is already in the active phase at the time of presentation, at the time of your latest internal examination. Okay, so now the question would be, which abnormal labor pattern are we dealing with? Is it the protraction disorder or an arrest disorder? So now we're left with only two choices. Okay, so when we say protraction disorder, it means that the labor is abnormally slow. Okay, from the word protraction or protracted, meaning slow. Arrest disorder means that the labor stopped, right? Or the progress of labor stopped. Now remember from my previous lecture that the normal labor curve has a shape of a sigmoid curve. Now if you see that the labor curve that you are plotting is gearing or tending more towards the right of that curve or that normal curve, then you will notice that the labor is abnormally slow. Okay, so that could mean that there is some protraction disorder involved. Also, of course, you have to diagnose protraction disorder using this diagnostic criteria that we have. So for nulliparous, a protracted active phase dilatation will be 1.2 centimeter per hour or less. For multiparous, it's 1.5 centimeter per hour or less. And for a protracted descent, For nulliparous, the descent will be less than 1 centimeter per hour, and the multiparous, that's less than 2 centimeters per hour. Now, let's go back to our curve. Is this a protracted labor curve or the rested labor curve? Well, obviously, the labor is not abnormally slow, okay? And you see here that there is some arrest that went on with the descent curve, okay? So it's easy now to rule out a protraction disorder. Now we're left with one option, the arrest disorder. The question now is, which among the four arrest disorders are we dealing with? Is it a prolonged deceleration phase, secondary arrest of dilatation, arrest of descent, or failure of descent? Now, going back to this case, which do you think among these four is the easiest to rule out? Obviously, it is a secondary arrest of dilatation. Why? Because the cervix of this patient reached full dilatation or 10 centimeters, and therefore we can easily rule out secondary arrest of dilatation. Now, is this a case of prolonged deceleration phase? Well, let me tell you more about prolonged deceleration phase, okay? So during the deceleration phase, the cervix dilates very quickly, but towards the end of the active phase, towards around 8 to 10 centimeters, the cervix dilatation slows down, okay? So when there is a prolonged deceleration phase, the progress in dilatation slows down after 8 centimeters cervical dilatation, and the uterine contractions become dysfunctional, even after oxytocin administration. In this situation, the cervix starts to swell and take on fluid. Now, in this situation, of course, you need a C-section for the delivery of the baby. Okay, so, well, obviously, we're not dealing here with the prolonged deceleration phase because the cervix fully dilated. Okay, so now we're left with two options, arrest of descent or failure of descent. So what can differentiate now between an arrest of descent or a failure of descent? The first thing to ask yourself is, did the fetal head engage? Remember, in the cardinal movements of labor, descent comes after engagement. So, let's go back to our case. Did the fetal head engage in this case? You know that there's fetal head engagement if the fetal head or the fetal presenting part reach stage 0. So in this case, the fetal presenting part is above station 0. It's actually at -2. It arrested at -2. So it means that it did not descend. Ergo, our diagnosis here would be failure of descent. And of course, let's look at the diagnostic criteria for failure of descent. Failure of descent means that there's no descent in the deceleration phase or the second stage. So our final diagnosis is failure of descent. Let's look at some more illustrations to illustrate further the different types of abnormal labor patterns. So we have here curve number 1. Okay, so obviously this is a prolonged labor pattern where the cervical dilatation is less than 4 centimeters. So automatically the answer is a prolongation disorder, a prolonged latent phase. The number 2 curve we have here, this is a abnormally slow cervical dilatation. As you can see, that the curve is leaning more towards the right, and it has almost lost its sigmoid shape because it's leaning more towards the right and almost like it's flattening towards the right. So that is a telltale sign that this is a protracted or a slow cervical dilatation. So we read this as protracted active phase of dilatation. So let's look at the third curve there. So look at this. This is a descent, and you see that the descent is abnormally slow because the curve here is again leaning towards the right of that ideal normal labor curve, and so we label this as a protracted descent. Let's look at the fourth curve here. Now, as it's obvious here that you can see some arrest disorder, right? Now, the question would be, is this a failure of descent or an arrest in descent? As I've said, ask yourself first, did the fetal head or the fetal presenting part engage? Obviously, it did not because it did not reach station 0. And therefore, this is a failure of descent. And lastly, we have curve number 5 here. Obviously, this is an arrest disorder. However, the descent of the fetal head is below station 0, and therefore this is an arrest of descent. All right, so here are more illustrations to help us practice with our dystocia curves. So here is number 1. This is a prolonged latent phase. Number 2 is a protracted active phase of dilatation. Number 3 is a protracted descent. Number 4 is a prolonged deceleration phase. Number 5 is a secondary arrest of dilatation. Number 6 is arrest of descent. And number 7 is a failure of descent. That's it for my lecture, and thank you for watching this video. Please don't forget to subscribe in my YouTube channel and my WordPress site, Ina Obigaine.